Hey folks, this is Sayukta from Vista Infosec and welcome back to our YouTube channel. Today we are diving into 7 topic of OWASP Top 10 series, which is identification and authentication failures. Whether you are a seasoned pro or just starting out, this video has something for everyone. Get ready to understand this vulnerability as we explore the topic together. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest uploads. Now let's get started. In today's digital age, where personal information and sensitive data are stored and exchanged online more than ever before, the importance of robust identification and authentication measures cannot be overstated. However, despite the advancements in cybersecurity, instances of identification and authentication failures continue to haunt organizations, leaving them vulnerable to various threats. As per the Open Web Application Security Project, which is OWASP, these failures represent a significant risk to both business and users alike. Identification and authentication failures occur when systems inadequately verify the identity of users or when users' credentials are compromised, leading to unauthorized access. OWASP, a trusted authority in web application security, identifies these failures as a critical issue that demand immediate attention from developers, security professionals, and organizations. Authentication and identification failures are once again a hot topic when it comes to web application security. Known as a broken authentication, in 2017, OWASP Top 10 list identification and authorization failures have fallen from #2 in 2017 to #7 in OWASP Top 10 for 2021. That said, broken authentication is still a major issue for companies and organizations. During web application penetration tests, we will often come across authentication and authorization issues. But what are authorization and authentication? How do they differ? Identification and authentication is the process of validating that a user is who they claim to be. This validation could be performed with one or more methods, including passwords, one-time PINs, authenticator apps, or using biometrics. Authorization is the process of validating that the user who has previously been authenticated has permission to perform a particular action. Identification and authentication failures refers to vulnerabilities in the identification and authentication mechanisms of a system or application. These vulnerabilities can arise from a variety of causes, including the use of weak or easily guessable passwords, the failure to properly validate user credentials, or lack of secure authentication methods. Identification and authentication mechanism of an application layer ensures security by verifying the source of request before granting access to application resources. In applications containing identification and authentication failure vulnerability, the application logic cannot associate a user access event with the correct user endpoint. One of the common examples of an identification and authentication failure is the use of weak passwords. If a system or application allows users to choose passwords that are easily to guess or can be easily cracked using brute force attacks, it may be vulnerable to attack, and attackers could exploit this vulnerability to gain access to sensitive data or perform other malicious actions. Another example of an identification and authentication failure is the failure to properly validate user credentials. If a system or application does not properly verify the identity of users, it may be vulnerable to attack. An attacker could exploit this vulnerability by providing fake or stolen credentials to gain unauthorized access to sensitive data or perform other malicious actions. Identification and authentication failures can have serious consequences, including the compromise of sensitive data and the loss of trust in affected system. To prevent these vulnerabilities, it is important for organizations to implement robust identification and authentication mechanisms, including the use of strong passwords and secure authentication methods. Now let's see what are the common identification and authentication failures. Despite the importance of identification and authentication, many systems still fail to implement them effectively, leaving users and organizations at risk. Here are the common reasons for it: lack of anti-automation controls, lack of multi-factor authentication, lack of security training for employees, and lack of password policies. In lack of anti-automation controls, a web application allows an attacker to automate a procedure that was initially intended to be carried out manually. This is known as inadequate anti-automation. An attacker might be able to execute brute force attacks or start denial of service if automated attacks are not detected and stopped. Lack of multi-factor authentication. Today, compromised credentials are the main cause of most data breaches. No matter how complicated it is, a single password is insufficient. Passwords can be cracked by hackers, and users may try their login credentials to hackers when they receive phishing emails that appears legitimate. A lack of multi-factor authentication will allow attackers to use these credentials to take control of the account. Lack of security training for employees. When we talk about cybersecurity, we typically think about how to protect the company from threats. According to organizations, it fall victim to cyber attacks every day for the two most frequent reasons: employee error and security awareness. Insider threats represent the security risk that develops within the organization. These hazards could be caused by current and past employees or contract having access to private information on the network and computer systems of the company. Lack of password policies. The first blockade in safeguarding a company's data and client information is a strong password. Yet many businesses have lax or non-existent password procedures, which increases the risk of being attacked. According to DigiCert, 73% of users have the same password for multiple sites and 33% use the same password every time. Exercising password policies and ensuring their strength while notifying users of regular password changes will help safeguard the system's security in some capacity. Considering the above mentioned reasons, we can summarize that identification and authentication failures commonly occurs when an application or a system enables automated attacks such as credential stuffing. If an attacker has a list of valid usernames and passwords, enables brute force attacks, allow default passwords, weak or well-known passwords such as password one or administrator, and many other. Identifying the reason of identification and authentication failures is the first step to mitigate them. Now that we have discussed the common reasons for identification and authentication failures, let's explore the identification and authentication failures attack scenario. In the following scenario, an attacker performs a credential stuffing attacks against an application that does not implement automated threat techniques. The attacker obtains a password database from a hacker forum. Attacker uses a credential stuffing with stolen password database. Since a weak hashing algorithm was used to encrypt passwords, the attacker can expose the user credentials. The attacker uses credential stuffing tools to test credential pairs on other websites. If the login is successful, the attacker knows they have a set of valid credentials. Now let's learn what are the techniques used to exploit authentication failures. Attackers use a range of techniques to exploit identification and authentication failures. This can include brute force or credential stuffing, session hijacking, session fixation, cross-site request forgery, that is CSRF, and executive after redirect. In credential stuffing uses a list of known passwords often obtained from dark web to attempt to determine authenticate credentials and gain access. Applications that do not have automated threat or credential stuffing protections in place can be used to determine valid username or password combinations, which can be then tried across different websites and applications. In session hijacking, attack happens when an attacker takes over your internet session, usually by targeting browser or web application sessions. Generally, what happens is that a person logs into an account, typically a bank account or online store, payment portal, etc. The website then installs a temporary session cookie in the browser, which allows the users to stay logged in and complete their business. A cybercriminal can hijack this session by gaining access to users' valid session, often by stealing the session ID within the session cookie. Once the true user leaves, the criminal can continue to act as the user, allowing them to make transactions, steal credentials, and more. Now let's see session fixation. Session fixation attacks are similar to phishing attacks in that the victim often clicks on a malicious link. With session fixation, the attack begins before a user even logs into a site or a web application. The attacker will often embed a session token into a URL, hidden form field, or a cookie, logging the user into a legitimate session. They will input their credentials, which will then can be associated with the session ID. The attacker, knowing the session ID, can access the user's account. Cross-site request forgery. Cross-site request forgery uses a social engineering to trick the user to submitting an unwanted action or malicious request. This type of attack assumes the identity and authorization of the victim to perform actions which cannot be distinguished by the website as forged. This type of attack can use GET, POST, or other type of HTML methods to unknowingly cause the user to transfer funds, change their email address, or take other actions. These are some real life examples of vulnerability according to the Open Web Application Security Project. First, Department of Revenue hack in 2012 and Microsoft Exchange hack. In Department of Revenue hack, a foreign hacker was reported to have stolen 387,000 credit card numbers and 3.6 million social security numbers from the South Carolina Department of Revenue. Why was this significant? IRS was hacked again in 2015, exposing people's social security numbers, addresses, incomes to more than 7 lakh people. This information was then further used to authenticate themselves to get transcripts of their victims, resulting in more exposed data. Even though in the first instance credit card data was encrypted, social security numbers and other personal identifiable data were not. Direct consequences of this incident would be the exposure of these people to identity fraud. In 2017, identity fraud study found that $16 billion was stolen from 15.4 million US consumers in 2016, and in the past 6 years, identity thieves have stolen over $1.7 billion. How does this relate to identification and authentication failures? The first breach in 2012 resulted from default password set in authentication layer. In addition, the lack of encryption on some sensitive data fields, including the social security numbers, increased the impact of this incident. Now let's perform some attacks on vulnerable websites. Our first example, here we are trying to execute a credential stuffing attack on demo.testfire.net. This web application is an open source web application for everyone to perform an attack. So for credential stuffing attack, we just try to manipulate or intercept the request of login page and try to get access of admin user by entering a multiple default credentials. Here for intercepting the request in burp, I am hitting normal string as XYZ to intercept the request. Here the request is intercepted and hitting that request to intruder. In intruder, we try to perform a brute force attacks on user ID parameter and password parameter. So for brute force, we just have to add dollar sign to username parameter and password parameter. So I am adding the dollar symbol to UID and password field. Now just select the attack type as cluster bomb. Cluster bomb uses multiple payloads. In payload section, just select payload set, and I have some default credentials already, so I am pasting that credentials directly. These are the list of credentials used by many people default, means that are guessable credentials. So we just start attack. After hitting the start attack, just check the length, cause it is giving a status code 302. So to verify that the request is proceed or not, just we have to check the length of that request or that payload set. So every response is giving 302 status code, but for admin and admin set, it is giving 30 status code, but length is changed. So to verify that, we just normally hit that request to repeater and send that request, because it contains the admin strings. Follow redirection, and after that we are successfully logged in into the admin user. Because it is showing the bank main JSP page, and see in render also it is showing admin user. To verify that, we try to check it on URL also. In URL, we normally enter the admin in credential parameters. Make sure the intercept should be off. Admin, in password also admin, and hit enter. We successfully get logged in into user. By this type of attack, we can manipulate the user credential and get access to their application. In our second lab, we are using Portswigger default lab, the lab which contains 2FA simple bypass. This lab's two-factor authentication can be bypassed. You have already obtained a valid username and password but do not have access to users 2FA verification code. To solve the lab, we just have to access the Carlos account page. Here they have given credentials for default and also for victims user account. For default credential, we just have to use the Wiener as a username and Peter as a password, and for victims credential, we have to use Carlos as a username and Monte as a password. So To solve this lab, we just have to log into our own account, and we have to enter a 2FA verification code which is sent by them as at email. We just have for email we just have to click the email client button to access the emails. After that, after logged in into account, we just have to make a note of the URL and simply hit the logout button. Now after that, we have to access the victim's credential by using Carlos as username and Monta as a password. After hitting login button, they ask for 2FA. So we actually perform the lab, try to access the lab. Here I am using the Wiener as a username and Peter as a password, and hit the login button. As given in description, we have for 2FA we have to click on the email client button. In email client button, in body parameter, they have given the security code as a 0067. So we just have to simply enter that code in this section 0067 and hit login button, and we get successfully logged in into the Wiener's account. So to get access to Carlos account, we just have to note the URL, and I simply hit the logout button. So we try to access the Carlos user now. Username as a Carlos and password as a Montoya, and hit login button. Now we have to bypass the page. We just change the login to my account and hit enter, and we directly get access to user Carlos. And by using this technique, you can manipulate anything that is sensitive and not manipulated by any other person. So here I try to change the email as abc@gmail.com, and I just normally hit the update email, and the email gets successfully changed. So by this type of attacker can manipulate any data of user. How can you protect against identification and authentication failures vulnerability? Preventing identification and authentication failures is crucial for an organization that wants to protect its sensitive data and assets. Here are some ways to protect identification and authentication failures. MFA hardware keys. According to OWASP, the most effective way to prevent broken authentication is to implement multi-factor authentication to prevent automated credential stuffing, brute force, and stolen credential reuse attacks. Multi-factor authentication adds an extra layer of security that is difficult for hackers to crack, which means that in order to safeguard users and resources, adding multi-factor authentication creates many layers of protection. Password policies. Strong passwords are critical to information security. The likelihood of illegal access or compromised data increases when password policies are not carefully thought out. The SANS Institute recommends that strong password policies include the following characteristics. It contains a mix of uppercase and lowercase letters, punctuation, numbers, and symbols. Contains at least 15 characters. Be unique from other accounts owned by the user. Never include dictionary words. Never include patterns of characters. Use of passphrases. General error messaging. General error messaging can be an effective way to prevent identification and authentication failures. When an error occurs during the login process, it is important to provide clear and concise error messages to the user. These messages should be informative enough to help the user understand what went wrong but not provide too much information that could be used by an attacker. If the error messages are revealing valuable information, attackers can leverage them to identify security weaknesses and use them to their advantage. Limit or increasingly delay failed login attempts. One of the most effective ways to prevent brute force and credential stuffing attacks is to limit the number of failed login attempts. This can be achieved by setting a threshold for maximum number of login attempts within a certain time frame, after which the account is logged out. Alternatively, the system can increasingly delay login attempts after a certain number of failed attempts. All in all, you should implement mechanisms to prevent exploitation using automated tools. Use password managers. A password manager is an application that securely stores and manages all your passwords in one place. Using a password manager can help you generate strong, unique passwords for all your accounts and prevent you from reusing passwords. This reduces the risk of a data breach affecting multiple accounts as well as the risk of brute force attacks. Security training. Security training is an essential part of preventing identification and authentication failures. It is important to educate users on best practices for creating strong passwords, avoiding phishing scams, and protecting their login credentials. As organizations continue to protect their applications from identification and authentication issues, there will be added mechanisms for authentication in place for protection. As a part of any good application security program, these applications will still be to be scanned and tested. Having a scanning solution in place to be able to authenticate appropriately through these security protections is essential for organizations to address their identity and access related vulnerabilities. Failures in identification and permission can have major effects on users and developers of web applications. Regular web application penetration testing is one of the best ways to guarantee that your applications and users stay secure. Protect your business from cyber threats with our expert penetration testing services. So contact Vista InfoSec today to schedule a consultation and take the first step towards securing your digital assets. Thank you.